Are they valuable?
This one is worth $50 in Miami. 50. You promise you won't tell anyone?
I promise.
Here's something most Bond fans never think about. The man who started it all, Sean Connery, actually had opinions about which Bond girls were the best. Not the producers, not the directors, not the fans voting in online polls. The actual man who looked these women in the eye, delivered those lines, and shared the screen with them. And when he finally spoke about it, his answers were not what anyone expected. Some of the most iconic names in Bond history didn't make his list, and one woman he chose had practically been forgotten by the time he brought her up. So before you assume you already know the answer, you probably don't. Here's what Sean Connery really thought. The man behind the pics. Why Connery's opinion changes everything. There's a version of this conversation where we just hand you a list and move on. But that would completely miss the point of why Connery's perspective matters in a way that nobody else's does. By the time Sean Connery became James Bond in 1962, nobody knew what a Bond girl was supposed to be. The term didn't exist yet, not in the cultural sense it carries today. Connery was handed scripts, shown his co-stars, and expected to generate chemistry with women he had sometimes only just met. The results, as history shows, were remarkable. But remarkable things rarely happen by accident, and Connery knew that better than anyone. What made his Bond different from every Bond that came after was a specific kind of grounded masculinity, not performed, not polished, just present. And that presence created a very particular dynamic with the women around him. It wasn't just that the Bond girls in his era were beautiful. Plenty of beautiful women appeared in later Bond films. It was that the chemistry felt real because Connery treated his co-stars as actual scene partners, not props arranged around him for visual effect. He respected craft. He paid attention. And when he spoke about the women he worked with, even decades later, it came from a place of genuine memory rather than promotional obligation. He gave interviews throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s where Bond kept coming up, sometimes because journalists pushed the subject, sometimes because Connery himself was in a reflective mood. Across those interviews, certain names came up again and again with a warmth that was unmistakable. Other names, including some the public would assume were obvious favorites, simply didn't come up that way. Not dismissively, just not with that particular energy. It's also worth pointing out that Connery played Bond officially across 6 films between 1962 and 1967, then returned for the unofficial entry Never Say Never Again in 1983. That's a wider range of co-stars than most people remember him having. Ursula Andress in Dr. No. Claudine Auger in Thunderball, Akiko Wakabayashi and Mie Hama in You Only Live Twice, Kim Basinger in Never Say Never Again. Each of these women brought something different. Each of them left an impression. But only 5 of them left the kind of impression Connery kept returning to. And here's the thing that makes this genuinely interesting. His criteria weren't what you'd expect. Physical beauty for Connery was almost beside the point, or at least, it wasn't sufficient on its own. What he responded to was something harder to define, a kind of self-possession, an ability to hold the frame without disappearing into it. Women who could give as good as they got, on camera and, by all accounts, off it too. What sharpened this further was the era itself. 1960s filmmaking operated differently from what came later. There were fewer takes, tighter schedules, and less room for extensive rehearsal. Actors had to arrive prepared and find their footing quickly with co-stars they barely knew. On a Bond production, which moved between multiple countries, worked with enormous crews, and had to manage the logistical complexity of location shooting long before digital tools made that easier. The pressure was even more concentrated. The women who thrived in that environment weren't just talented. They were resilient, adaptable, and secure enough in their own instincts to perform under real pressure without losing the human detail that makes a performance worth watching. That's the filter Connery was working with, whether he articulated it in exactly those terms or not. The women he remembered most vividly were the ones who didn't buckle under those conditions. They rose to meet them. So as we go through each of these 5 women, keep that in mind. This isn't a ranking based on who looked best in a swimsuit or who had the most memorable entrance. It's a window into how Connery understood the job and what he believed made a Bond girl truly great. Claudine Auger, the one he called a complete actress. Most people who rank Bond girls put Ursula Andress at the top and treat the tone. Conversation as settled. Connery didn't see it that way. Claudine Auger, who played Domino in Thunderball in 1965, was someone Connery spoke about with a very specific kind of professional admiration that went beyond the usual diplomatic praise actors give each other in interviews. He noted more than once that she was technically accomplished in a way that made his job easier. And in Connery's vocabulary, that was high praise. Auger was French, trained as an actress in Paris, and had actually won the title of Miss France in 1958 before pivoting fully to film. She came to Thunderball with real credentials, not just beauty, but experience. And it showed. Her Domino is a woman caught between loyalty and conscience, living as the mistress of the villain Emilio Largo while concealing the grief she carries for her dead brother. That's a genuinely complicated emotional situation to inhabit across a film that is also, simultaneously, filled with underwater chase sequences and exotic locations and the general sensory overload that was 1965 Bond. What Connery noticed was that Auger never lost the thread of who Domino was underneath all that spectacle. In quieter scenes, and Thunderball has several, she brought an ache to the character that grounded the whole film. The moment near the end, where Domino turns on Largo, is one of the most satisfying payoffs in the entire Connery era. Not because of the action mechanics of the scene, but because Auger had spent the whole movie building toward it. She earned that moment. Connery also commented on her instincts during filming. He observed that she understood pace, when to hold back, when to push, when to let silence do the work. These are not easy skills. Plenty of experienced actors never fully develop them. Auger had them naturally, or had trained them so thoroughly they looked natural, which amounts to the same thing. Thunderball itself was the biggest box office Bond film of the Connery era, outperforming even Goldfinger in raw ticket sales when adjusted for the period. A lot of that had to do with the scale of the production. Thunderball went bigger than any Bond film before it, with a budget that reflected the franchise's exploding popularity. But a big film needs something anchoring it emotionally, and Auger provided exactly that. She and Connery shared a chemistry that felt unhurried and authentic, which is harder to achieve in a film with that much logistical pressure than people typically appreciate. What also distinguished Auger, in Connery's memory, was her discipline between takes. Larger productions create a particular kind of chaos. Long waits, constant interruptions, the difficulty of maintaining emotional continuity when the camera has been repositioned for the 14th time and the lighting crew needs another 40 minutes. Many actors lose the thread in those gaps. Auger didn't. Connery noted that she came back to each take with the same internal consistency, as though the interruptions simply hadn't happened. That kind of sustained concentration is a professional skill as much as an emotional one. And it's the sort of thing a co-star notices immediately, even if an audience never consciously registers it. What audiences register is the result, a performance that feels whole rather than assembled from disconnected pieces. She was, by Connery's account, The kind of actress who made the scene rather than just appearing in it, and for a man who had by that point appeared opposite some of the most compelling women in the industry, that assessment meant something. Mie Hama. The performance, Connery said, surprised him most. You Only Live Twice from 1967 is often discussed in terms of its spectacular production, the volcano lair, the ninja army, the sheer ambition of a film that essentially swallowed an entire Japanese island for its backdrop. What gets discussed less is the specific dynamic Connery had with Mie Hama, who played Kissy Suzuki, and what he later said about working with her. The word he used in various forms across different interviews was something close to surprising, and not in a condescending way, in the way that professionals use when a co-star brings something to a role they didn't anticipate and couldn't have scripted for. Mie Hama's path to the film was genuinely unusual. She was already a major star in Japan when she was cast, the kind of recognizable face that prompted genuine excitement at locations in a way that the Western cast did not. But her English was limited, and there was real concern during pre-production about whether the language barrier would constrain what the character could do dramatically. The production reportedly had a contingency plan where the roles of Kissy and the other Japanese Bond girl, Aki, played by Akiko Wakabayashi, might be switched if communication difficulties became a problem on set. They didn't need to switch them. Hama found a way to communicate everything Kissy needed to communicate without relying on dialogue as a crutch. And Connery, who was nothing if not perceptive about what was happening in front of the camera, picked up on it immediately. He later described her as an actress who understood that the camera reads intention, that you don't need to announce what a character is feeling when you simply feel it genuinely and let the lens do its job. Kissy Suzuki is, on paper, a fairly contained role. She's a diver, a local contact, eventually Bond's nominal wife as part of his cover identity in rural Japan. She doesn't get the elaborate villain-adjacent backstory that Domino gets. She doesn't have extended dialogue sequences. What she has is presence, a quiet authority in every scene she's in that makes her feel essential rather than decorative. Hama also performed much of her own physical work in a film that was extremely demanding from a production standpoint. She trained extensively for the diving sequences. She committed to the physical requirements of the role in a way that Connery explicitly recognized as professional seriousness. And Connery's respect for that kind of commitment was well documented throughout his career. He was not an actor who gave easy compliments. He had opinions about craft and was unafraid to express them. When he described Hama's work in You Only Live Twice as something that genuinely caught him off guard in the best possible way, it registered differently than the polite appreciations actors offer when promoting a film. He was reflecting on it years later, unprompted, which is usually when the honest assessments come out. There's a broader context worth adding here. You Only Live Twice was Connery's fifth Bond film, and by that point, he had made no secret of his exhaustion with the franchise. The pressure, the loss of privacy, the sense of being reduced to a single iconic image, all of it was wearing on him visibly. He would walk away from the role entirely after this film, which makes the warmth he retained for his co-stars in it all the more telling. When a person is done with a job and still speaks well of specific colleagues years later, that's not courtesy, that's genuine regard. Hama was one of the people he carried forward from that complicated final chapter with real affection, and it says something about the quality of what she brought to the work that she registered so clearly in a period when Connery was otherwise ready to close the door entirely. Daniela Bianchi, the one he kept coming back to. Out of every woman Connery worked with in the Bond series, there is one name that appears in his reflections more consistently than almost any other, And it is not the one most people would guess. Daniela Bianchi, who played Tatiana Romanova opposite Connery in From Russia with Love in 1963, was someone he returned to in interviews across a span of more than 3 decades, always with a particular warmth that suggested the film had left a lasting personal impression. From Russia with Love is widely considered the most purely crafted film of the Connery era. Where Dr. No was a beginning and Goldfinger was a statement, From Russia with Love was a sustained exercise in tension, style, and character, influenced heavily by Alfred Hitchcock's approach to suspense, driven less by gadgets and spectacle, and more by the slow build of genuine danger. The result is a film that rewards attention in a way the more operatic Bond entries don't. In the middle of all that craft was Daniela Bianchi, an Italian actress who had been runner-up at Miss Universe in 1960 and was, like Claudine Auger, a beauty queen making the transition to serious film work. She was 22 when the film was made, Connery was 32, and the dynamic between them on screen, the KGB agent who is supposed to be manipulating Bond but develops genuine feelings she hadn't planned on, works because both of them commit to the emotional reality of it without winking at the audience. Bianchi's Tatiana is one of the more psychologically complex Bond girls in the entire franchise. She enters the story as an operative being deployed as a honey trap, believing she is serving her country. As the film progresses and her relationship with Bond deepens, she has to navigate the gap between the mission she was given and what she actually feels, and she does it without the character becoming melodramatic or incoherent. That's a genuine achievement in a genre that doesn't always make space for that kind of subtlety. Connery talked about the Istanbul sequences in particular, long stretches of the film where he and Bianchi had to sell a relationship that was building against a backdrop of increasing paranoia and threat. He noted that she had an emotional intelligence in those scenes that made the work feel collaborative rather than mechanical. They were, by his account, genuinely creating something together rather than executing a predetermined result. There's also something to be said about the physicality of their chemistry. From Russia with Love is a notably sensual film by the standards of its time, and the scenes between Connery and Bianchi carry a heat that was remarked upon by contemporary reviewers. That chemistry wasn't a production accident. It came from 2 actors who were actually engaged with each other and with the emotional logic of the story they were telling. Bianchi made relatively few films after From Russia with Love. She stepped back from acting in the late 1960s and has rarely sought the spotlight since. But for Connery, the collaboration clearly meant something that time didn't diminish. The regularity with which her name appeared in his later reflections on Bond spoke to a connection that went beyond the professional courtesies of filmmaking. It is also worth noting what Bianchi was navigating personally during production. She was young, relatively new to international filmmaking, working in a language that was not her own. Her dialogue was dubbed into English in post-production, which is a detail that often gets mentioned as a footnote, but actually points to something significant. She was performing in full awareness that her voice wouldn't be the one audiences ultimately heard, which means the entirety of her performance had to live in her physicality, her expression, her timing, her eyes. And it did. Every emotional beat that Tatiana is supposed to register comes through without the benefit of the vocal instrument most actors rely on heavily. That Connery considered this the performance he returned to most often, across decades of reflection, is an assessment that becomes more remarkable the more carefully you think about what she actually accomplished. Ursula Andress, the entrance that created an archetype. There is a before and after in Bond history, and it is the moment Ursula Andress walked out of the ocean in Dr. No in 1962. That image, the white bikini, the diving knife, the expression of complete indifference to the fact that she had just walked into film history, didn't just launch a career. It established a visual language for the Bond girl that every subsequent film in the franchise spent the next 60 years responding to, sometimes echoing it, sometimes deliberately subverting it, but never quite escaping it. Connery was there for that moment, and what he said about it later was revealing precisely because of what he chose to emphasize. He didn't talk about the image. The image speaks for itself, and always has. He talked about Andress as a presence, as a person on set, as a force that the camera had no choice but to follow. Ursula Andress was Swiss, 25 years old when Dr. No was filmed, and already someone with a clearly defined sense of herself. She had been living in Hollywood for several years, had been in a relationship with James Dean, and had developed the kind of self-possession that comes from navigating a difficult industry on your own terms. She was not someone who was going to be told what kind of Bond girl to be. She arrived as herself, and what happened on screen was the direct result of that. Honey Rider, the character she played, is not written as the most complicated woman in Bond history. She's a shell diver, resourceful and self-sufficient, who has survived a difficult life on her own instincts. The backstory is lean. The dramatic demands, compared to Tatiana or Domino, are relatively straightforward. What the role required above all else was a specific quality of presence, the ability to occupy the screen so completely that the audience simply accepts this woman as real and compelling without needing a detailed psychological architecture to justify that response. Andress had that quality in a way that was, by Connery's account, immediately apparent from the first day of shooting. He described working with her as effortless in the specific sense that nothing needed to be negotiated or worked toward, but the chemistry was simply present. That's an unusual thing to be able to say about a co-star, and Connery was not given to exaggeration on this subject. The iconic scene on the beach required multiple takes, as these things always do, and Connery later remarked that Andress's composure throughout the process was remarkable. She understood what the scene was doing and what it required of her, and she delivered it with a consistency and an ease that professional actors recognize immediately as a rare thing. You either have that stillness or you don't. She had it. Dr. No was made on a budget that would seem absurdly modest by modern Bond standards. There was no guarantee it would succeed, no franchise mythology to lean on, no template to follow. Everything about what James Bond would eventually become was still entirely unknown. Andress and Connery were building the thing from nothing, and the rapport between them in that context, two people creating something genuinely new, comes through every time you watch the film. What is less frequently discussed is the degree to which Andress shaped her own image on that production. She has spoken in interviews about her involvement in decisions around costume and presentation, the white bikini being perhaps the most consequential wardrobe choice in Bond history, a choice that she had clear opinions about and was not passive in making. Connery's recollection of her from that production consistently emphasized this same quality of active participation. She was not waiting to be directed into an image. She was constructing one, consciously, with full awareness of what it could mean. That level of intentionality at 25, on a production where nobody yet knew whether the film would even find an audience, is a different order of professional instinct than simply being photogenic and available. Connery recognized it immediately, and the film reflects the result of two people who both knew, somehow, that they were making something that would last. The other dimension worth noting is what Andress did after Dr. No. She parlayed the role into a genuine international film career, appearing in major productions throughout the 1960s opposite some of the biggest names in the industry. That trajectory wasn't accidental. It was the direct consequence of how completely she had owned that first Bond appearance. Connery watched that career unfold and took quiet satisfaction in it. as someone who had witnessed firsthand what she was actually capable of. Honor Blackman, the one who was his equal. By 1964, when Goldfinger went into production, James Bond had become a global phenomenon. The first two films had demonstrated that the formula worked. The studio had money, ambition, and momentum, and they cast, opposite Connery, a woman who had spent 3 years on the British television series The Avengers, playing a judo-trained intelligence agent who routinely fought men twice her size, and won. Her name was Honor Blackman. She was 37 years old, and she was not remotely impressed by the Bond franchise or what it expected of its female cast. That lack of impression is, by Connery's own account, precisely why she ended up being the Bond girl he described most consistently as an equal. The character's name, Pussy Galore, has consumed a disproportionate amount of critical discussion over the decades, partly because it is an objectively unusual name to encounter in what was, theoretically, a mainstream entertainment film. But Blackman herself was philosophical about it in interviews, pointing out that the name came directly from Ian Fleming's novel, and that she had taken the role because the character interested her, not because she was unaware of how the name might land. She knew. She simply decided it didn't matter compared to what the part actually gave her to do. What the part gave her to do was, by Bond film standards, genuinely substantial. Pussy Galore is not a victim or a reward. She is the head of her own all-female aviation squad, a skilled pilot, a direct antagonist in the film's central conspiracy, and the only person in Goldfinger who occupies the same moral gray zone as Bond himself. She is working for the villain, but not out of stupidity or helplessness. She has made a calculation, and the drama of the film turns partly on whether she'll remake that calculation when confronted with the reality of what she's been contracted to help accomplish. Blackman played all of this with an authority that came from her years on The Avengers and from a personal refusal to play Bond girls as ornaments. She knew how to handle physical scenes. Her judo background from the television work was real, not performed, and the fight sequence between Pussy and Bond in the barn is one of the more genuinely physical confrontations in the early franchise, because both performers were actually capable of the movements required. Connery talked about her in terms that were distinct from how he discussed the other women on this list. With Bianchi and Auger, the emphasis was on emotional chemistry and technical craft. With Hama and Andress, it was on presence and instinct. With Blackman, he used language that suggested genuine intellectual engagement, the sense that he was working opposite someone who was thinking as hard as he was about the scene and who pushed back, not disruptively, but productively, when something wasn't working. She was, by multiple accounts from the Goldfinger set, not shy about her opinions. She had views about her character and communicated them. Connery respected that enormously. In his framework, the best co-stars were the ones who arrived with their own perspective fully formed, who didn't simply adapt to whatever the scene required, but brought something of their own that the scene then had to accommodate. Blackman did that in every frame of Goldfinger. The age gap between them, Blackman was 7 years older than Connery, was not something either of them ever treated as significant, and the film doesn't treat it as significant either. They meet as peers, which is relatively unusual for Bond and is part of what makes Goldfinger hold up as well as it does. The romance, such as it is, feels like a negotiation between two people who are each looking for an angle, and the fact that it resolves the way it does carries actual dramatic weight. There was also a meta-dimension to what Blackman brought that Connery was perceptive enough to register. By the time she arrived on Goldfinger, she was not simply an actress taking a role. She was a known quantity. British audiences recognized her from The Avengers as a woman who did not get rescued, who did not wait, who solved problems with competence and occasionally with a well-placed throw. That audience expectation traveled with her onto the Bond set, and into every scene she filmed. Connery understood this intuitively. He later reflected that playing opposite someone who carries that kind of existing authority changes what's available in a scene. It raises the level of the exchange, because the audience is already disposed to take her seriously, which means Bond has to as well. That mutual seriousness, he suggested, was what made their dynamic in Goldfinger feel different from anything else in the series. They were, in the most precise sense of the word, matched. Goldfinger went on to become one of the highest-grossing films of 1964 globally. And Blackman's performance was singled out by critics at the time as a genuine departure from what Bond films had previously offered in female roles. Connery was aware of those notices and agreed with them, not grudgingly, but with the straightforward recognition of someone who had watched a colleague do exceptional work and saw no reason to qualify the assessment. 5 women made Connery's list. Dozens didn't. And some of the names he left out are ones most Bond fans would have bet their lives on seeing here. If you think someone was robbed, and there's a strong argument for at least 2 names that never came up, tell us who and why in the comments. The most interesting case gets its own video. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.